Welcome to Miss Martin Music and Muses and Catholicsplaining. Prepare yourself. You are about to be Catholicsplained. And no, my new name is not Music. That was a Freudian slip. But who is not Freudian is himself, the man himself, OMB Reviews, Odin of Odin fame and Friday Night Tights and all sorts of good stuff. Welcome back to Miss Martin Muses.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always fun to have these discussions because, as you know, my typical conversations on my channel are mostly box office numbers related and movies, and I get to sneak in some theology here and there. It's part of the
Yeah.
I feel like the ministry that I've kind of been called to in that. And this past week, we're able to finally get some conversations about the Pope and the upcoming conclave, and it was a very fun discussion with the chat, especially since there's a lot of people from all different faith backgrounds there. So thank you for having me on again.
Oh, well, for sure. And this is a very interesting time. This is my third rodeo, my third interregnum. The first one I experienced was during John Paul II after he passed away, where we're we're popeless. They're sedevacant. There is no pope on the throne at mass. We prayed for our bishops or archbishops, but the part where we pray for Francis, our pope, was not there. It just skipped over because there is no pope.
Yeah, it's one of the beautiful things too about the liturgy, especially during this time. It's very appropriate for our conversations tonight, right, about the Latin Mass. But the beautiful thing about the liturgy is just how that empty space really just makes it that much more real. Because so many of us and many people had opinions about Pope Francis, have had opinions about variety of popes, right, that we've had, whether it be John Paul II or Ben the 16th or Pope Francis. And it's just that moment where it just connects you to say, oh, he was our Holy Father. We were praying for him every single Mass. And now all of a sudden it's out. And so it's just this beautiful way of making what is happening in reality, what is actually going on, feel that much more real and authentic. And that's why I just love the Mass so much.
And it keeps us sane, if you will, that even during this time of transition, you have that sense of normalcy, and that the Holy Mother Church, in her wisdom, gives us the tools that we need to handle this situation. I was not the biggest fan of Pope Francis. It felt very weird feeling that way after having John Paul II and Benedict the 16th. But, he still was the Holy Father, and you do feel this sense of emptiness. And I just like the fact that we've been having a novena at my church. We pray it
Mm-hmm.
before Mass for the soul of Pope Francis, and that there are special masses being said. And Cardinal Burke, for example, just released and has been encouraging people to pray a special novena to Our Lady of Guadalupe at this time. So, it's just really comforting to have those rituals.
Absolutely. And the novenas, especially because you've got Cardinal Burke. You've also have Father Chad Ripperger has had his prayer about this. And then the one that I've been praying every day, and I pray it with my students also, is the one from Bishop Athanasius Schneider. It's a very, very good one. And there's this great app called Intercede, I think is what it's called now. It used to be called the Prayer app, the Pray app, Pray Novena app. You can still find it. There's an online version of the site too. And Intercede is just this beautiful app that helps you pray novenas essentially. And they've put these in. So when Cardinal Burke had his 9-month novena to Our Lady Guadalupe, they had that in there. And so literally you could every day like keep track of whether you had prayed it that day. And right now we're doing the novena that was put together by Bishop Athanasius Schneider, and so it's really cool. And it is, again, this beautiful thing that we see in the church, right? The 9-day novena prayers themselves are just such a beautiful tradition, and one that we often don't hear, I think, enough talked about, or sometimes we take it for granted, right? People say, oh, novenas, whatever the world that is. But again, it's such an important time to pray for the repose of the soul of a deceased pontiff, right? For the soul of Pope Francis, but also, and even almost in certain respects, right, or at least for us here on earth, almost more importantly for this upcoming conclave, because there's a lot of things that really hang in the balance. There's a lot of confusion, I think, in our world, more so than ever before. And all we can do is pray for the Holy Spirit to intercede, and for the people to open up their hearts to the Holy Spirit, the cardinals to do this, so that way we can get a good and holy pope. And that's been kind of like the main idea and the main message of this novena prayer from Bishop Athanasius Schneider, which is, give us holy popes, right? We need holy popes again. We need a return to normalcy and tradition. And again, beautiful time in the church. It's something that my students just do not appreciate. I told them last week, hey, by the way, the funeral mass for Pope Francis is Saturday. You should check it out because it's this thing that we never get to witness. We just never get to see that often. And I asked them this week, and I was like, oh, how many of y'all checked it out? And one of them said, oh, I think I saw a clip on TikTok. It's like, oh, okay,
No.
great. So it's something, though, I hope at least when the conclave starts, maybe they'll have more interest, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, and we do know now that the conclave will begin on May the 7th, and that will consist of a mass and a procession, and then there will only be one smoke. It sounds terrible. I keep feel like I'm talking about cigarettes, but they will have two ballots, and then we'll have black smoke or white smoke, and it will be probably black smoke. I think I'll be very surprised if it's white smoke on Wednesday.
Yes. So, yeah, in the law, it states that on the first day, there shall be only one vote. And I think it's actually good to do it that way because it helps the cardinals figure out kind of where everyone stands. And then it gives them all that time remaining for the second day of voting, which has 4 votes, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. And that is why also typically we don't have a pope until the second or third day in most modern conclaves. The longest on record was 5 days. And so I would say if we don't have a pope by Thursday or Friday of next week, there might be an indication that there is some tension within the college, because if someone can't get that 2/3 majority in those 9 total votes at that point, if by the end of the third day there isn't yet a pope, I think that is definitely a sign that, okay, there might be actually a kind of behind the scenes, or I guess the better word for it would be an unexpected choice or a second tier choice, I think is what some, online people have been mentioning. So either way, it's exciting times, and I'm hoping and praying for us to, at the very least, get some clarity. No matter who it is, clarity is something we really desperately need right now.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point of the Pope. I keep telling people he had one job. The Pope has one job.
Unity.
When Jesus says, strengthen the brethren, when I am gone, strengthen the brethren. That's all. I mean, obviously there's more to it than that, but it's like, yeah, don't drive the brethren to despair, okay? It's bad enough. I keep saying it's bad enough being a unicorn in this world, being a weirdo for being a Catholic. And then the Holy Father, and I know it's very confusing for the priests, because they're like, what should I be preaching then? It used to be you could look at the catechism and say, okay, as long as it's going in line with that, then that should work out all right. But
yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's so interesting in the wake of Pope Francis's death, because some people that we are used to hearing from are now all of a sudden speaking with a lot more openness. And I think that tells volumes as far as how the Vatican was being run. Because when you have even a Bishop Barron, and he's about as mainstream as you can get, and there's a lot of things with him I don't agree with. There's a lot of beautiful things that he does in his ministry I think is very important, Word on Fire. But even he, in a recent article, I think it was for First Things, was mentioning how chaotic the pontificate was, and how much confusion there is. And so it's like, if even someone like him is finally coming out and saying things where it's like, I wish you had been saying this for years, but then you think to yourself, I probably know why you weren't speaking that way, because if you had said anything like this while Pope Francis was alive, he would probably have gotten his head cut off in a very real way. And so I think that to me tells a sign that maybe the cardinals are not thinking, and this is the other thing too, anyone who claims to know who's going to be the Pope or how many votes there are, right? There's now this rumor going around that Cardinal Parolin has 50 votes already in the bag. And I'm just like, look, anyone who thinks that they doesn't know anything. As the old expression goes, the person who walks in as Pope walks out as a cardinal, because really amazing things can happen once those doors are closed.
Correct. It's clickbait at its worst. It's one of the things that has really frustrated me in general about X, is that people are looking for engagement. They're not looking for truth. Of course, nobody knows. And I've been telling people to be warned that they are going to try to discourage us. They're going to try to make us afraid. They're going to try to maybe frighten us into not praying. The evil one is like a roaring lion going around, and don't listen, because as you said, anyone that claims that they have insider information, they're just lying, to be honest, because if you had it, you wouldn't be broadcasting it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
either
just,
either that or the inside information they have is as thin as you can get. Because,
mhm,
okay, even if you talk to an actual cardinal and that cardinal told you something about the numbers or something else, guess what? Those numbers can change on a dime. Those numbers
mhm,
can change almost instantaneously. And so, and the fact that those are numbers given before the conclave has even officially started. I mean, again, there are amazing things that happen once that door is closed, once they are
mhm,
locked in there. Because, yes, is there politicking? I'm sure there is. They're human beings. It's just a natural thing, right? For people to vie for power. But there's also something else amazing where people walk in and people expect certain results and then things go a very different way. And I think a great example of that is you look to John Paul II's election. I mean, you
mhm.
think about how odd it was for them to choose a Polish cardinal, but then also you look at how many votes it took, and it was clear he was not the first choice.
No.
Like, because it took a few extra days that on that conclave, I think, or it was like on the third or fourth day, and so that tells us that okay, it took a little while for them to maybe even find him as a compromise candidate to a certain extent potentially. Um, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. And it's one of those things where it's like, I'm excited for it. And it's also like, I'm trying to be very wary of that excitement because it's like, I can't treat this like a sports event. I can't treat
Mm-mm.
this like
Yeah.
a, yeah, rah, rah, go team. But at the same time, it is just naturally, it's always exciting to see because there's going to be a change no matter who it is. Even if it's a quote Francis II, there's still change because no one is going to be like anybody else. And so even if someone has all the same beliefs as Pope Francis, the fact is they're going to govern differently just by their nature.
Yep.
And I think that we at the very least need a difference in governing style. And I think that could be a huge benefit.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting that everyone always talks about how open and kind and generous he was. And he's probably the most autocratic pope I've seen in my lifetime, for
Yeah.
sure. And usually, what people stereotypically think about the pope is the way he was behaving. And it was very hard to watch, to be honest, because it's like, come on, people, let's be good to each other. Let's have charity. Let's have some prudence. Um, I was just curious. Something that you said triggered a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been to the Sistine Chapel? Have you gotten to see?
Never blessed to
Oh,
do so. It's one of those. It's on that bucket list, right? It's something that I know when it comes to things that my wife and I plan to do together. That's one that she's like, if I were to ever like win the lottery or if I were to like
mhm,
win an all expenses paid trip, she would be like, no, you can't go unless I'm there with you because she wants to. And she is an artist, so she
mhm,
loves Italy. She loves Rome, especially, and she loves like all of the art pieces there. And so she wants to show it from that lens. And so
mm,
she's like, look, I want you to be able to go and have the religious experience there, but I also want to go and show you my side of Rome, like through the artistic lens.
mhm. Sure.
So it's definitely on our list of things to do.
Excellent, because I can tell you this, you think you've seen it until you see it.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad to this day said it was the single most impressive thing he's ever seen in his life.
Mm-hmm.
You have, until you've been there, you just feel like heaven literally has touched earth, and you finally know this is what the fuss about Michelangelo was all about, because no picture can make justification of it. And so when I imagine that these cardinals are going to be in there, and you said that, hey, once they get in there, I'll tell you what, I think it would be very hard to not be open to the Holy Spirit in the presence of such an awesome painting and such brilliance. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and
Oh,
especially because if you think about the history of conclaves, um, and how like as far as the conclaves being in the Sistine Chapel are concerned, there was a large portion of the entire millennia really of the church's history where conclaves weren't even a thing,
mhm,
and when the conclaves eventually were there, they didn't always take place in the Sistine Chapel, and so that's the other thing too, right? Is that you have the last judgment looking down
mhm.
upon you, and
Yeah.
then you're in this place that only so many. I mean, there's really not. You could probably count on like a certain like there's really hasn't been a lot of conclaves. Like there's been 266 popes, but not all of them were elected through conclave. And then a lot of those popes lasted for a very long time. And so there really haven't been a lot of conclaves happening inside the Sistine Chapel. And so to be a cardinal in there with a very select job and to be one of the few that's ever experienced that, I mean, there's just no way. And that's why I keep saying, right, no one can know what the mind of that person, that cardinal, is going to be when they go in there, because the weight of that moment can change people in such a massive degree. I think the example that people usually like to mention is Pius IX. When Pius IX was chosen, when he was elected, people thought he was going to be a very certain type of pope. And then sure enough, clearly the weight of the office got to him and he became something very different than what they thought. They thought they were going to get progressive, and they ended up getting one of the most orthodox popes that we've ever had.
Yeah. I always tell people that this has to do with the Eucharist, that being in the presence of the Eucharist for a few seconds literally changed my life. I went to Mass with some friends when I was in college because the Protestant service was going to go on forever. And so I was like, I'll go to Mass with y'all. And it literally changed my life. My life hasn't been the same since, 30 years on. Sometimes part of me is thinking that's the moment that ruined my life. But on the other hand, in an instant, like the world can go from black and white to color. It's very, powerful experience. So, yes. Yeah, crazy times. And apparently you drive a Chrysler. Is that true or is that fake news?
Now, if it's a Chrysler, maybe, but it's definitely not a Chrysler branded car for sure. What's up, Steve?
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, we do bless our cars. So, when you get a new car, then you get it blessed. You get your house blessed. So we're all in favor of that. Everyone's saying hi to
the rosary.
Yeah, there we are. Me too. Everyone, St. Christopher and Our Lady of Loreto. And I think this is a good segue into a topic that has come up about with this new Pope, and it is the Latin Mass. Can you kind of go into, well, first of all, what do we mean when we say the Latin Mass? Because the Latin Mass is not the Mass that most people go to in the Latin Rite, just in Latin. It's actually something very different.
Yes. And so for anyone out there who's Catholic, right, you have the Mass that you go to on Sundays, right? The vast majority of people are going to have a very specific understanding of what the Mass actually is. It's in the vernacular language. It is, there's the liturgy of the word, liturgy of the Eucharist, right? These are things that we learn, kind of growing up in catechism post-Vatican II, right? The terms that we're very used to. For those that maybe aren't Catholic, just think of it in this way, where there was a certain way in which the Mass was celebrated within the Roman Catholic Church for well over 1,000 years. And then in the 1960s, there was a shift. There was a change. So kind of before getting into that, let's go back in time a little bit. So first, people usually ask, like, when did the Latin Mass come into existence? And some people say, oh, it's sometime after the Council of Trent, and it was established by Pope Pius V, and that it was created in that way, and that's why it's called the Tridentine Liturgy. That's not actually true. But you also have to be very specific, because the Mass as it currently stands, right, is basically a variation of a variation of a variation, because things have changed over time. So there are also within the Mass certain prayers that date back quite a bit. So even the English translation, for instance, of what we call the Roman Canon, or in the new Mass it's called Eucharistic Prayer 1, that dates back all the way to like the 300s or 400s. Ancient prayer. The Kyrie eleison, the Agnus Dei date back to the 4th, 5th, 6th century, right? So some of the prayers and parts of the Mass are very, very old, no matter what language they're in, for that matter, right? As we know it, though, the Roman liturgy had been going through certain developments. We have certain early indications of what the Mass was like. If you look to the work of St. Justin Martyr, for instance, he gives a description of what a Mass is like. And there's a lot of elements that we can see in the Mass even of today, even of the Novus Ordo, right? And so the Mass started off, right, where there was a reading of Scripture. It was led by, as it says in that work, the president, presider. We know that word also translates to the priest, right? So the leader of the congregation is the one who leads in the reading of Scripture. And then it transitions over into a reception of the Eucharist, right? So there's this Eucharistic presence, and this understanding of Christ being present in the Eucharist dates back, right, to the very early centuries of the church. And it's not something that was developed later on. That's oftentimes said. No, from the very beginning, the church has always understood the Eucharist to be what it is. And so we look to that and we see kind of those examples of what a mass may have been like. But the Latin Mass as we have it today really can go back to right around the time of like maybe a thousand to maybe like 1200 AD, as far as the structure that we kind of have as a mass today. Because there are other masses, there are other versions of the mass, or what we call liturgical rites. A rite is just a way in which the liturgy is celebrated. A liturgy, by the way, is a public work. It's a work done for the people, with the people, right? And so that's why we call it a liturgy, right? Because it's a public offering. And so there are many types of rites that exist. So that's another important point there. Eventually, though, by the time of the, Protestant Reformation, there were a lot of different rites of the Mass being celebrated. There were some liturgical abuses happening at that time. So people making up their own prayers, for instance, making up their own new traditions. And it became a little confusing because, the church is supposed to be universal, but it's also supposed to be authentic, right? Because that word Catholic, I think it gets a bad use today in the modern Catholic Church, because people say, oh, Catholic means universal, which means it's for everybody. Yes, this is true. But Catholic's also an identifier. Catholic's also an identification mark, because in the earliest stages of the church, I think it was Ignatius of Antioch, actually, who's the first to use it in that way. It was a way of saying, no, we are the authentic Church of Christ and not that heretic church over here, right? All the Arians, that's not the Catholic Church. All of the, pick your heresy, right, from the early centuries. It's like, that's not the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, as a name then, was meant to distinguish it from anything and everything else, right? And so because of that, what they did and what Pope Pius V at that time wanted to make clear was, okay, there has to be then this uniform way of celebrating the liturgy. And what he decided to do was he said, okay, if your liturgical rite, your way of celebrating the Mass, dates back to, century, I think the cutoff may have been 100 years. There's some specific mark, I always forget what it is, but he said basically, if your liturgy is X amount old, hundreds of years old, then you can keep it. It doesn't have to change really at all. But if it's younger than that, you can't have it anymore. You have to follow the standard Roman rite that he is going to codify and establish. So all that he did was he established, okay, here is the codified version, the codified way of celebrating the Mass. We would say it's what you find in a modern missal, right? A missal is a book like this that has the different readings, the propers, the prayers of the day, but also the canon, the structure of the Mass itself. And so all that he did was he codified it, right? He put it into a work so that it could be preserved, passed on, and then people across the entire Roman Church could know exactly how to celebrate Mass with the instructions, basically. So that way everyone was on the same page. Now, again, if you had one of these older traditions, these older rites, you were able to continue that. So there was a Dominican rite, there was an Ambrosian rite, there was a Gallican rite. I mean, there's so many different ways to celebrate the liturgy, and you were allowed to still have those. But hey, the Pope said there has to be a singular way that in Rome, in Italy, we pray. In the whole Catholic Church as well, there should be a uniform way that, again, if you don't have an older tradition, that you'll also pray. So that way we don't have any of these liturgical abuses happening of people making up prayers and making up nonsense, basically. And so, though some people say that's the start of the Latin Mass, as I mentioned, right, there are certain parts of the Latin Mass that actually go all the way back to the early 300s, earliest parts of the church. But the actual structure even goes back to around 1000 AD or so. And so all that he did was codify it, say, here's what it is in stone. And then since that time, there's been changes, there's been adaptations. So new feast days, for instance, a way in which the prayers are sung, other prayers being added in at certain times. There was, of course, the most common one is what's called a low Mass, when there's no music. It's all done very quietly and silently. It's my favorite type of Mass personally, because I get to pray. I just get to sit there and experience God and be able to pray. And they added in these prayers at the end. I think it was Pope Leo XIII. And he had prayers for the church, right? For the freedom of the church, to be freed from persecution, to be freed from all the chaos going on, right? So we have all this stuff happen, right? And please let me know if I need to go back or
No, I mean, this is
Okay.
great stuff. Another one that I think about is also they added Saint Joseph to one part, like that it was like
Yes.
Mary, the Mother of God, and then Saint Joseph, her spouse, like that was added in. And I would add, you're saying some of this stuff was like second, third century. I would argue of course, obviously the way that the Mass was being celebrated, that was obviously at the very beginning of the
Yes.
church. And we have that. Look at in the book of Revelation. I always tell people, like, the book of Revelation, a lot of that actually is the Mass, and
Mm-hmm.
on earth as it is in heaven, and you will find them in there. And then you have, you see Ignatius of Antioch. You mentioned that about where their bishop is. There is Jesus Christ. There is a Catholic Church, and that was contemporary of St. John the Apostle. And then you have Irenaeus. He was the one who described a lot of the Mass, like the way it would work, and like the way that they would all confess their sins, and then they would do that. But I know what you mean when you're talking about some of the more structural liturgy things, because
Mm-hmm.
the early church was really the early church, but it still had the aspects of it that we have in Mass. That, they gather together, they gather under the bishop, that there's a celebrant, there's readings, and there's the confession, and then you receive the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's some things that people don't always realize, and that's why I love the Latin Mass, and especially a
Hmm.
Latin Mass Missal, is because people forget just how much of the Mass is, as you mentioned, not just revelation, but scripture. I
Hmm.
mean, so much of the Mass is just scripture. And the great thing about these missals is that it actually tells you, hey, this comes from the Psalms, this comes from
Hmm.
Revelation, this comes from this part, this part, this part, right? And that's what's so beautiful about it. And so and that's why, as you mentioned before, like, do we even call it the Latin Mass? Is there a better name for it? Because the Latin Mass itself indicates language, right? And
Hmm.
that's just kind of the contemporary way we've described it. So I have no problem using it, because people, if you use other terms, may not even know what you're talking about, right? But
Yeah.
as you also mentioned, so we have this liturgy that was codified, right? Again, in form, it's existed for about 1,000 years. And many of the prayers date back even more so than that. But the form itself, right, we could argue is codified and is made, more rigid and structural in the 1500s, right, by Pope Pius V. Quo Primum is the document that he made, which codified the Mass, and it goes into more detail about the justification for it, and who's allowed to, keep the old rites and things like that. And so from that time going forward, though, just minor changes happen over time, just that natural progression, right? We think of it
Hmm.
as a way that you have a tree, and that tree maybe gets a little bit crazy, right? And so it has to get pruned. And that's exactly what happened, right? It had gotten a little too crazy. The tree had grown, the liturgy had blossomed into this beautiful thing, but it was a bit tangled. It was a bit crazy. And so all that he did was he said, okay, let's snip off these extra pieces here, and let's just form it what it is. And that's exactly all that pruning that happens. That was, of course, until it wasn't even actually Vatican II. It was actually in the 1950s where some major changes happened to the actual liturgy. There's things that happened to the divine office before then, but the liturgy itself, and this is where you hear sometimes a debate about Holy Week. Pre 1955 Holy Week is usually the discussion, right? And basically, the same minds that eventually brought changes to the Mass already did some testing, like a test run almost, with the pre 55 Holy Week. So what they did was they changed the structures of the Holy Week liturgy. They removed several readings. They simplified things. And the justification was, okay, well, some of these masses were really long. Some of these liturgies were a bit too long for the modern man, and so they needed to be changed in some way. But again, all of that it was really doing was taking kind of like a hatchet to the liturgy, right? We had never
Hmm.
seen change to that extent since the 1500s, just to give you some context there. So over 400 years, very minor, very small natural changes. And then all of a sudden in the 1950s, massive hacking changes happen, right? And that kind of sets the stage for what happens eventually. You have Second Vatican Council. They issue a document called Sacrosanctum Concilium on the liturgy, which is actually a fairly beautiful document.
Hmm.
And it speaks about how you have to have pride of place given to the Gregorian chant, how you have to be very respectful. It talks about all these important things, but it also says, okay, there should be more vernacular so people can understand what's going on. Maybe the homily, or at the very least the gospel, should be read at some point in the vernacular. And so if you just went based off of that, you would think, okay, it sounds like natural changes, things still happening. But then there was something called a concilium. So the Vatican Council happens, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document is issued, and then the Pope gets together a group of experts. And
Mm.
this is when things go to hell in a handbasket. So, same people that kind of hatched up the Holy Week liturgy are also being brought in on this concilium to talk about how the Mass should be structured. And what they come up with is the Novus Ordo that we call it today. And the Novus Ordo just means the new order of Mass. And so another name for the Latin Mass then could be the Vetus Ordo, which just means the old order, right? So the old order, new order. It's another way of looking at it. And in the new Mass, not only did they change it so that it's celebrated in the vernacular, right, in the local language of wherever country you're in, but they also ripped out prayers completely. So there used to be prayers at the foot of the altar in the old Mass. Those are gone. The reading of St. John's Gospel at the end of Mass, pulled out, gone. And people have done the math on it, and it's, if you compare what the Mass was to what it is now, I think only about 20 or 30% of the prayers, if not less actually than that. Actually, no, 13%. Yeah, sorry, 13% of the prayers from the traditional Latin Mass remained intact from the previous iteration. So when people have that wrong perception that, oh, it's just the Latin Mass translated into English. No, the Mass actually, the structure was changed, prayers were ripped out, and very little was actually retained completely. And the Roman canon I mentioned earlier, which remember dates back all the way to, we're talking like, again, 300s or 400s, all of a sudden you now had other options that just came out cold cloth. Some of them are argued to have come back from, I think one actually does in many ways come from a Jewish prayer journal or a Jewish prayer book. And so there are certain prayers that have like maybe other histories, but in the Catholic Church at the very least, it was brand new. It was a novelty, as we call it. And that kind of has led to the liturgy wars that we have today going on. But anyway, a bit of roundabout there. I'm terrible going off the cuff and going off my head.
No, that's great. Well, see, that makes some sense to me because I've read the Second Vatican Council documents and I don't have a problem with anything that they say in there because they never really said to do all of what you just described. But so what you're saying is it's everything that they were doing afterwards, because if it was going to be, for example, in English, or if they wanted some of that, well, then they would just look on the other side of the missal, and that's what it should have been, if that's what they were calling for. So I was always so confused. It's like when sometimes people hate Second Vatican II or something, and I do sometimes say, it's like, oh, you know what? The Vatican II didn't say that. It didn't say get rid of Gregorian chant. It said actually the opposite. It said keep Gregorian chant. It's the primacy of place in Latin. And of course, Latin, especially with the ordinaries, is so important because the more global we've gotten, we need to have a universal language. And you even see this when you like go to Rome in Mass, and even with, if you went to Mass with Pope Francis, the ordinaries would be in Latin, and everyone could participate because it was the universal language of the church. It's like what English is to airline pilots. Everyone has to know English if you're going to fly. Same idea.
Exactly. And that's why the Latin Mass is so beautiful, and it's so unifying, right? And that's the thing that just always gets me is when they say, well, no one understands Latin. It's like, but here's the thing. Latin as a universal language, right? Why was it kind of codified in Latin? Because Latin is and has always been the language of the church. It was sanctified on the cross with those words, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which is why we have a very special place for not only Latin, but also Greek and Hebrew, right? Because those are very holy languages. They're not supposed to be regular every day. And that's the other thing about Latin as well, is that because it's a dead language, it's actually perfect for the liturgy, because it means that what the words are what they are. They cannot be changed. Our language can change. Our language is living, right? Words today mean very different things. Like, we can obviously make up new words, but there are certain words that we'll say that because of the times, they mean something very, very different now. And, I'm trying to think of a clean example, unfortunately, because there's a lot of examples that are not necessarily clean, but I'll use a music term, right? There's a music term, retardando, right? And there's a portion of that word that you used to say, and it meant something specific. And obviously over time, the meaning has changed, and now you can't even say it anymore because it's offensive. So, but Latin, you don't have that. Latin it is like a crystal. It is beautiful. It is stuck. And because of that, it can't be tampered with. And that's why it's actually important, because if the liturgy can get tampered with, and we see it happen, right? People, because it's now in the vernacular, people can make up their own prayers. They can do their own thing, and nothing happens to them. And it ends up causing a lot of,
and it takes you out of the Mass when a priest does that. Now, I must say that I'm kind of pleased that it's different now than it was when I first came to the church back in the 90s. And I think it's because a lot of those children of the 60s were the priests then, and they
Mm-hmm.
have kind of been retired out. I have seen less and less of that kind of improvisation of the mass for the last 20, 15 years. So, because I think that the new priests that have been coming in, they understand this because they were children of this confusion, if you will, in the 80s and the 90s. And if you are choosing to become a priest in this environment, you really need to be on. Like, you couldn't be complacent. Like back in the 50s, I'm not saying they were complacent, but when
Mm-hmm.
everyone was Catholic, when you all went to Catholic schools, you were all in the Irish neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, whatever it was, where everyone was Catholic, it you didn't have to try hard because everyone was doing it. But
Mm-hmm.
to choose to go into this direction, it, well, for lack of a better word, is a choice. I would also add about the universality of Latin for the majority of, well, the last 1,000 years, especially when you're looking at the Middle Ages in the West. If you knew how to read, you knew Latin because that's just what people did. If you went to university, things were in Latin. So it's not as though no one had Latin. Yeah, it was the dead language, if you will, but things were written in Latin. Even my dad, when he was in school and he went to a public school, it was like, yeah, you want to know Latin because he wanted to go into medicine. It's like, well, then you need to get fluent in Latin. So that was
Mm-hmm.
what he took as a second language. So it's
Yeah.
not as though Latin is, for lack of a better word, Greek to people. It really
Mm-hmm.
was something that everyone spoke and everyone wrote in.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, it also, I think, by saying, "Oh, we have to change the language because people are too stupid to understand, or they just don't know
Mm,
Latin anymore," it's actually really an insult to the centuries and centuries of believers that, guess what, they didn't have these handy little hand missiles that we have
that's true.
today, right?
Hmm.
And that goes for whether you're at the English Mass or whether you're at the Latin Mass. Doesn't matter because we have these things that we can use to help follow things along. For a lot of times, what they were doing, and that's why if you look at some of these old churches, especially, one of the things you'll all notice about them is that there's no chairs, there's no pews. The
Hmm.
original masses were done in these giant, cathedrals, basilicas, and it was just open space. And it was because the priest was going to be at the altar performing the sacrifice, and we were there to be present for it, to offer worship to God. But it was all about that. It wasn't about us, it wasn't about our comfort. It wasn't about making sure that we're being accompanied, right? But they did not just leave people to their devices either. That's why there was a homily, a sermon, because that was the
Hmm.
opportunity to explain, here's what's going on, here's what the readings say, and here's the message that you need to know for today. But also because guess what? The more you went, you knew what was going on. You didn't have to hear
Hmm.
any of the words that were being said. You could tell, okay, he's going to do this now. Oh, he's going to do this now. You could figure it out. It's body language. Just again falling into that habit. I mean, it's gotten to the point where I go sometimes with my parents come in town. They'll come with me to Latin Mass, and it's so funny because they're older, and so for them, they still have to have the missal out at all times. My dad is a huge stickler. He wants to know every single. He wants to follow along with the priest
Hmm.
directly. Like he just that's just the kind of person he is. So when the priest is speaking very low, as he often does at that mass, it's like he just can't keep up with it. For me, it's like I don't need to see everything now because I've been to enough of the masses to where I know exactly what's going on. I read the propers, and that's all I really need to do. I don't even need to hear, um, or I don't even need to see the normal prayers, like the part of the canon, the part of the
Hmm.
general rubrics of those anymore.
Yeah. Well, and that's why the bells are so
That
important
too.
because that
Mm-hmm.
would then signal to people, hey, kids, this is it. This is the highlight of the Mass now. This is when the consecration is going to happen. So there used to be some bells before the consecration started. And when I, even today, when I sometimes go to the Latin Mass and yeah, you can get caught up in the spirit, if you know what I mean. You're sitting there
Mm-hmm.
praying, you're doing all this stuff. And then you hear the bells. It's like, ooh, here we go. Here we go. This is
Yeah.
it.
Exactly. And it's like I go with my son, and he is at that age where he has no idea what's going on. So and as a
Hmm.
dad, and he's got I have ADD, and I think he does too. it's about trying to make it so that he's not, distracting other people and like trying to keep him as contained as I can be. So I usually bring some snacks for him, and that usually keeps him pretty well occupied. But like there's times when he just has questions, or he wants to show me a picture that he just drew, or something like that. But having the bells there, even then, it's like, even though I'm used to it, even though I can follow along and we can actually hear what's being said, those bells are that, like, oh, hey, the consecration's happening right now, guy. We have to we have to quiet down, right? This is really important. And so yeah, but that's how people knew, right? People who are uneducated were able to know exactly, hey, here's what's going on. That's also why they would ring not just the bells in the church, they would ring the church bells, because then everyone in the town, let's say there was someone who was sick at home, guess what? They heard those bells, they knew, consecration. And so they could still actively participate in the liturgy without having to actually say the words or even know what's being said. And that's the hardest thing, I think, to transition out of the Novus Ordo to the Latin Mass, is that in the Novus Ordo, it's almost like you're expected to say something. You're expected to, quote, participate. And it's so hard to actually pray when that's going on, because it's like, oh, I have to say words now. I have to say words now. I have to say words now. Whereas in the Latin Mass, the whole mindset's different, because no. The priest is offering the sacrifice. He's leading our sacrifice right now. Yes, I'm here, right? And obviously the church desires me to be there at least on Sundays, holy days of obligation. And that's how I offer and fulfill the commandment, right? To honor the Sabbath, right? To honor proper praise and worship to God. But at the same time, guess what? If I have to go take my son to the bathroom, because now my brain had to switch for the Latin Mass, now it's like, oh, it's okay. If I'm not here, guess what? Sacrifice is still going on. The priest got this. My being here is not going to affect that sacrifice. I mean, again, I need to obviously offer worship to God, and in that way we could say it affects me. But it's such a relief in certain ways, because it makes you think, okay, yeah, really, the sacrifice is going on that altar right now by that priest, and that's what's important right now. Not me, not my comfort, not oh, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what Father's saying. None of that matters, because sacrifice is happening.
Yeah. Well, I remember Latin when I first was exposed to Latin. It was in public school. Like, I sang more Catholic sacred music in my public school choir than I ever have in a Catholic church, until I started going to the Latin Mass and I joined the choir, because, and I can't really tell you the structure of Latin. I can't tell you the grammar of Latin. We just memorized it. So when I hesitate to tell people that I know Latin. I'm like, I know Latin if it's a song I've sung, or if it's in the Mass, or if it's a prayer. But so you can get things through rote. It's very easy, just the same way you learn a song through rote. Like, if you're listening to your favorite pop song, did you learn it because someone gave you a piece of paper and you studied the words and you looked at all the music? No, you heard it. So it's very natural to do that. Another thing I like about this whole mentality of with the quiet, and with the way that the Latin Mass works, and the way that it depends a lot on also the atmosphere and the art that teaches you. It makes us become like little children. And Jesus said, unless you become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. How do children learn? Picture books. How do they learn? Their parents sit there and read to them. They talk to them. And that allows us to become little children and allow God to get into our hearts. And I must admit, the first time I went, I was very confused, but I didn't have anyone to explain it to me. I was like, what's going on? Where's the priest and all that? And I have been to dialogue Latin Masses, and those are fun too. I have no problem with that, because the Latin Mass actually is more flexible than people think. Like, there weren't like real strict things. It's like, no, it must be exactly like this. Like, that you can have a dialogue low Mass, or you can have a high Mass or a low Mass, or
just
the
for the priest, really. I mean, and that's the reason why, like, people, when do I sit? When do I kneel? In general, the missals does not say, okay, every person has to kneel at this exact time, because the missal is more focused on what the priest has to say and do. And that's what's so beautiful. And that's why there can be variety in that respect. That's why we call it customs, right? There's local customs that you can follow. And it's because, again, it's pretty mum. It's very silent on what the congregation does during those times.
Yeah, except for the kneeling. I think that's always, for me, that's always been the constant, no matter what, is that when those bells hit, when well, and how can you not fall on your knees? Like they say in the Old Holy Night, fall on your knees, oh, hear the angel voices. It's like, and the angels are just there. It just gives me chills thinking about it. And I'm saying this as someone that right now I regularly attend the Novus Ordo Mass for
Hmm.
various reasons. Sometimes, sometimes that's just the way it is. But I will definitely say objectively, I like the Latin Mass a lot better.
Hmm.
And I was very saddened. Well, first of all, I was very saddened as a person to learn as a new Catholic that they did this to the people, like that they changed it, and they changed it very quickly. That's what I also
Hmm.
understand. Tolkien, I think, is a very, very good example of what it felt like. And he was very vocal. He was not J.R. Tolkien one
Hmm.
little bit happy about it. And you had like even Agatha Christie, that's what they
Uh-huh.
call it sometimes, the Agatha Christie indult in England,
Hmm.
that she wasn't even a Catholic, but she was like, would you smash the Sistine Chapel or whatever? She said, would you smash a work of art? Why are you doing this? Like a whole bunch of people, artists signed something to Rome saying, no, I don't think you should do this.
Hmm.
But of course they did anyways.
Hmm.
And then we had the second round, which we experienced because John Paul II loosened it. And then Benedict the 16th did a motu proprio that just basically said, hey, it was never abrogated. This is the mass of the Latin Rite. And if you are a Latin Rite priest, if you're a Latin Rite Catholic, it's almost like you have a right to this mass just as much as anything else, that there was no restrictions now. So if you were a validly ordained Latin Rite priest, you could offer the Holy Sacrifice in according to that the missal that was codified in Trent, and people flocked to it. And you see, it was huge. If you would go even today, where they still allow it, I mean, it's huge. And it
Yeah.
was vocations were flying out the window. I mean, priests were just springing up like water, and nuns and sisters. It very vibrant Catholicism there, and it revived and saved many churches. Like the church I went to when I lived up north, it saved the church because the parish was going to be closed down because of low numbers, and the priest was like, oh, I'll invite the FSSP to come in and do the Latin Mass, and boom, it saved the church because so many people came there for it. So what happened with Pope Francis? What on earth happened? It was insane,
Oh
in my humble
man,
opinion.
no, it really is, and I think it's something that a future council and a future pope are going to have to address because there's a
Hmm.
lot of issues that come about with it. But yeah, as you said, like once that motu proprio from Benedict XVI was issued, with a huge rebirth in Latin masses being offered, in interest, right? Because hey, it's just like surface area. The more area you have, the more contact that's going to be made. Same thing with
Hmm.
the masses. If you have more masses that are offered in Latin, guess what? More people will come about too. But what really got things going was actually COVID, right? Because when they decided to, and again, I think there's still a lot of seeking forgiveness that needs to be done by our shepherds, because I have
Hmm.
not heard any real apologies from any of the bishops, even the good bishops that I like. I have not heard really any apologies, any vocal apologies for shutting down the masses, shutting down the liturgy, shutting down the sacraments during COVID. Because I'm
Hmm.
sorry, there's just no way to defend it. When you put the needs of the flesh above the needs of the spirit, you are doing the work of Satan. And I think that it's something that needs to be sought after. So I just had to say that because it's just always like, I'm always like,
No.
oh, get so frustrated. But because of all that nonsense, people were forced to watch streams online. And because of that, more people actually got exposed to these Latin masses that were being offered online. And actually, that led to another massive explosion in interest
Hmm.
in and going to the Latin Mass. And in addition to that, the more traditional parishes and also Latin Mass parishes tended to be the ones that actually were offering masses going against those orders, right? The
Hmm.
traditional priests were the ones actually saying, you know what, we're still going to offer you the sacraments, or we're just not going to put it in the public bulletin. But hey, if you show up, I can't stop you. And
Yeah.
that was the kind of stuff that was happening in those more traditional parishes. And so, because of that, you see this massive boom of the traditional liturgy coming in. That's actually when I especially became that much more interested in the traditional liturgy and in all the things that were going on with it, because we at our diocesan church had only just gotten the weekly Latin Mass around that time, around the time that COVID ended up striking. And so all this stuff is going on. It's a huge increase. And then all of a sudden, as you mentioned, right, Pope Francis makes a decision and he issues his own motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, very interestingly named Guardians of Tradition, in
Hmm.
which he rescinds Summorum Pontificum, which allowed that document had said, all right, Latin Mass has never been abrogated. Every priest, therefore, has a right to celebrate it. They don't need to get special permission. It's a right that people have. And then what Pope Francis decided to do was say, no, actually, there's only one unique expression of the Roman rite, which is the Novus Ordo, and therefore you no longer have the right to say this and to say this Mass on your own. In fact, we expect all people of God to, at some point, return to the Novus Ordo. We're going to allow some Masses to exist still, but we want to limit it, and basically, we want to push it to the periphery, is essentially what the document said. But the real evil that was done, and I cannot know his heart, I cannot know exactly all the information that he had, but based on everything that we do know, someone lied. Because the whole justification for this movement to shut down the Latin Mass, because that's what Traditionis Custodes basically did, was said, hey, guess what? If you have it, it really can't be in a general parish or general diocese anymore. It has to be in a small chapel. It has to be in a very specific location. It has to be out of the diocesan setting. It has to only be done by these special Latin Mass societies like the FSSP or Institute of Christ the King. And it was really an attempt to try to do away with it, to try to kill the Latin Mass. And the justification that was given at the time was that apparently a survey was sent out to the bishops, a survey asking, hey, how has Summorum Pontificum been for you? How have you implemented it? How has it been received? How are you thinking it's going? And the word that we were told by the Holy Father and by others there was that apparently a huge portion of the bishops came back and said, well, this is actually causing a lot of problems for us because these Latin Mass goers are showing schismatic tendencies and they are denying Second Vatican Council completely and all these terrible, terrible things. The issue is that, and thanks to the amazing work of Diane Montagna and a lot of the Vatican news press, like who are much more friendly to tradition and much more honest, they decided, hey, we're going to look into the survey. And turns out the survey was bunk. It wasn't true. It wasn't real. Yes, I'm sure there were a few bishops who may have said some bad things, but apparently people who had actually seen the results said, no, overwhelmingly people said positive things about Summorum Pontificum. Overwhelmingly, bishops were actually pretty happy with how things were going because guess what? Those were the largest parishes. Those are the ones that were booming, bringing vocations. Yeah, you had a couple parishes maybe here or there where maybe there were some more schismatic tendencies, but that's how almost any parish goes, right? You have tons more Novus Ordo parishes where a lot more heretical things are actually going on, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it was something, and that's where, for me at least, it felt like a giant slap in the face by the Holy Father. And that's why a lot of us who are in the Latin Mass community, when we found out about the Pope's death, we didn't feel joy, but we felt relief. And it's sad to say that, but it's true. And again, I know other people might feel that also for other reasons, because doctrinally there were some issues there. But for us, it felt like, wow, that sort of Damocles that was hanging over us, it feels like, okay, there's a little bit of a break. Because there was no actual good justification for removing access to the Latin Mass.
Yep. I mean, we all know, and you know that I've expressed great frustration about some very loud influencers on X or somewhere, that are, for lack of a better word, a bunch of jackasses that are doing that. But he should know better. The Vatican should know better than to judge things on some loud influencers that are definitely not a part of the representation of the whole. And, sometimes you don't even know if they're even honest. Sometimes people just like to stir things up to get clicks. So yes, you will find some of those people, and every now and then you might find one or two, but you made up a very good point that if you want to blame bad attitudes, schismatic attitudes, heretical attitudes on the way that the Mass is celebrated, it would actually make more sense to do it with the Novus Ordo, because you see the statistics and you see the surveys and you see, this many Catholics follow the Church's teachings on that. But that's absurd too, to blame it on that. I mean, there's obviously other reasons going on for anything, but to blame it on a Mass and how the Mass is celebrated is very disingenuous. And it's also, I remember just feeling so gaslit by the title of it, as you said, guarding tradition. It's like, yes, guarding tradition, pal. I mean, this is, it's as though someone were to take Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and say, "Nope, burn it. We're never going to play it ever again."
Mm-hmm.
That would be absurd.
Or at the very least saying, you know what, we're gonna take like a couple of bars here and there, put it
Yeah.
together into something, and then it's still gonna be just as good. And any person with music theory or any other training, you listen to it and say, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
This it's like, yeah, it's music, meaning that there's notes that are playing, but
Hmm.
it's like there's so much that's missing. That's exactly what happened with the mass, and that's exactly the kind of nonsense that was being pushed by this. And yeah, absolutely, gaslight's the best way for it, because again, claims were made by the Holy Father that we found out were not true. And so again, the question has to be asked, does that mean the Pope was lying, or does that mean the people that told the Pope these things were lying? And either case, there's a problem there.
Yeah.
There's a big problem. And so I think a future Pope absolutely needs to address that. Obviously, I think a future Pope needs to rescind Traditionis Custodes completely, and not just to reinstate Summorum Pontificum, but I think, the best case scenario would be to say, no, full rights back to Latin Mass completely. Obviously, I wish I could go further than that, but again, I think it just, more realistic terms, I think that would be the
Hmm.
way to go going forward, because it really is. It's not even just saying, oh, I like the smells and bells, or I like the Latin language, because as you said, any of these masses that we're talking about can be celebrated in the Latin language. It's because the structure is different, and this is where there are other cardinals and bishops who are a bit more honest with their thoughts, and they're critical of the mass, and they're more open about why. And it really comes down to, I forget exactly who it was that said this, but one of the bishops has said to something to the effect of, well, that's not, the liturgy of the Tridentine Mass, the liturgy of that time, it represents the teachings of that time, and that's not where we are anymore. And it's like, whoa, okay,
No.
you're kind of letting the cat out the bag there, because what then they're saying is, because the traditional Mass therefore brings about traditional belief, that's where the problem is, too.
Yep.
And
And I
that's what
think
some of these behind the scenes cardinals and bishops are trying to shut down is, oh, they don't want people to have the same faith that was always there up until the 1960s, basically, right? They don't want people to have that anymore. And so it's like, okay, now you're revealing the game here, saying something changed and that it is not what was once there. Okay, this is a problem.
Yeah, and I think that one could say, who could it be? Who could be behind this? I just can't
Mm-hmm.
imagine, to use
Mm-hmm.
the church lady thing. Could
Yes.
it be Satan? It's like, who wants that? God is not the God of confusion, but we know who is all
Mm-hmm.
in favor of confusion and who is the minion of chaos, and it's not the Holy Spirit.
Mm-mm.
So definitely there were wolves in the shepherd's place. I mean, we've even seen this even more literally in the case of things like the was it McCarrick and
Mm-hmm.
Rupnick, and it was just like, wow, really, really.
Yes.
Even today, I have a family member say, "Don't they know what church they belong to?" Because as someone on the outside looking in, everyone knows that it's always the cover up that's the problem. I mean, obviously it's a horrible, horrible scandal, but
Yes.
it's like, didn't they learn from what happened like in 2001? I forget when that big one thing blew up in Boston. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
don't
Spotlight.
they know it's that if you try to cover it up, it will never stay secret.
No, and
It,
they're paying for it too.
mhm,
And that's again, I think right now what we need, kind of tying back to what we mentioned at the beginning too, with the conclave, is we need a pope that's going to not just bring trust back to the church, but is going to actually bring about real good changes to the finances,
mhm.
to the responsibility that's needed, because there needs to be accountability more so than anything else.
Yep.
What we need is a pope that's going to basically say, hey, here's a list of all these cardinals and here's the things that they've done. They're now excommunicated. That's what we
Yeah.
really need. We need that level. I know that's not how the Vatican typically works. I know that the church, again, is like a glacier, right? It works in centuries. It doesn't work in, but there are certain things like these scandals that cannot move at that pace. They just,
Nope.
they can't, because there are too many people that have left the church because of the scandals. And again, even though I think it's a terrible decision to leave Christ on the cross, because you're not comfortable, because of the problems and the sins of others, right?
Mhm.
To abandon Peter because of Judas. I understand why someone might feel that way. But at the same time, there is a level of responsibility that has to be taken up by the Vatican, and it all starts at the top. If the Pope can start doing something like that and allowing us to really see down the line real change happening, that I think is what's going to bring people back. Because you saw it this past Easter, right? Even despite all of the craziness of the pontificate of Pope Francis, we had almost record numbers for recent years, especially of people coming into the church at the Easter Mass. So clearly there's a hunger there, and a lot of it's younger people. A lot of it's people who are being drawn to these more traditional parishes. Even the Novus Ordo parishes are the ones that are growing. Those more liberal progressive parishes, they're failing. There's Pew Research came out with this study where basically people who consider themselves to be politically liberal and Catholic, that's gone. It's like non-existent. It's essentially completely disappeared. And so they have to figure out, hey, by the way, maybe if we just stick with orthodoxy, maybe things will actually be okay.
Yeah. I mean, we do need to reach out to sinners, etc., but you also have to feed the people that are already there. It just doesn't make any sense to say, oh, look, we want people to be Catholic. Oh, all these people are Catholic. They like being Catholic. They're faithful Catholics. Let's crush them. I mean, that's absurd. And then in the same breath, they say they want more priests and we need more people coming to church. It's like, well, words are failing me. I get a little sputtery about this because it makes me very mad. And it's like, yes. I mean, imagine if in the prodigal son thing, because we do get the point of the prodigal son, that the older brother, needed to be glad that his brother was back from sin. But what the father also said to the older brother in the prodigal son, he said, you know that I love you. You know that everything that I have is yours and you're going to get your reward, all that stuff. But, we need to rejoice in this. But the attitude during the Francis pontificate, if that had been a Francis attitude, he would have been, you were faithful to me. You never sinned. You never did this. You need to quit being so rigid. Oh my gosh. And never tell him, never speak to him with love. Never speak to him with, you're going to get your reward. It was just like there weren't any kind words for the people that are there. And, what father will do that to his child? Your children, imagine if you did that to your kids, if you never hugged them, you never told them you loved them, and you're just like, well, there's other kids that need love. And it's like, no, you need to be a father. Pope means papa. It means father. He needs to be a father to his children. And we do welcome sinners. I mean, especially with the ministries that we have, especially to post-abortive women, for example. I mean, we're very, very welcome. And it's the traditional people that are the most welcoming of sinners. But you've got to show love to the people that are there. And that's what a new pope needs to do for the people of God.
And it all starts with clarity. I mean, that is the main thing, because as soon as there's confusion, that's when people tend to scatter. That's when people tend to stop going. That's when people tend to turn their backs and turn away, because people don't like that. They want to be sure of something, and they want to make sure that the people that they believe are leaders and are in charge are actually taking charge and being leaders. Otherwise, they will be led into a myriad of other things. And that's why, going back to the Latin Mass too, it very much connected to this. There's a reason why when they survey Latin Mass attendees about where they stand on moral issues, where they stand on church teachings, 99% all agree and all assent to the church's teachings. You switch that over to the Novus Ordo, and it's very sad. Was it a third of people that go to Mass, and that's even people that go regularly, even don't, actually are the ones, a third are the ones that actually believe it to be the body and blood of Christ. And you go into any other metric, even the ones that go to Mass weekly, it's clearly showing, obviously if you go to Mass weekly, your chances of, having better, numbers there, but the fact that it's even what it is, right? And that we're talking about moving from maybe a third to 2/3, depending on whether you go to Mass weekly. It's like, okay, that's still a bad thing, because that's still a third of the people going to Mass weekly, or 2/3 of the people going to Mass weekly that are rejecting core teachings of the faith. So I don't know about you, but I think I'm going to go with the Mass that's bringing out more alignment to the church's teaching than less alignment to the church's teaching.
Yeah. And it just boils down to it's the Mass. Can you imagine Jesus? I keep saying, can you imagine Jesus sitting there feeding the 5,000 going, Well, there's a right way to do it, and I don't like all these people that are showing all this faith in me. Yeah, it just is absurd.
Hmm.
It's you need to feed the sheep. That's the other thing that Jesus said to Peter: feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed us, be a father to us. Well, we're done at the end of the hour, and I always like to say, is there anything maybe that we brought up today, or anything coming up as far as a conclave, or
Hmm.
that you maybe didn't have a chance to bring up, or I wanted to clarify, or do a nice little conclusion?
Yeah, I would say if anyone is interested in the traditional liturgy, there are lots of more resources than ever before. We live in a
Hmm.
golden age when it comes to how much information that we have now. There's a great video that I was watching right before the stream started, just to give me a little bit of a catch up on it. It's an actual channel called Historia Ecclesiastica, and I found out about him actually because he did this excellent breakdown of conclaves. So he goes back
Mm.
to, hey, here's what papal elections were like in the first century. Here's what they were like in the third, and he goes through all this information. He basically does podcast length, like hour-long lectures, essentially on various topics, and he has a whole hour-long episode about the history of the traditional mass, and he goes back all the way to the very beginning of what liturgy was like in those early centuries. And so I think that that's a great source. So again, that's Historia Ecclesiastica. He's got tons of great videos all over the place. I would also recommend a documentary series called Mass of the Ages. If you've never seen
Mm.
Mass of the Ages, it's free online on YouTube. Great production values. Part two, especially, is so important because it goes into the history of the Concilium, the group that came
Mm.
up with the Novus Ordo Mass. It goes into all that history, and then the ending of it is one that's interesting because when they were making the film for part two, they did not have Traditionis Custodes had not come out yet. And so by the time it got released, though, it had. And so part three initially was going to be about something else. And then it eventually just became all about Traditionis Custodes and the people that it was impacting. It's a beautiful trilogy of movies dealing as documentaries with the Latin Mass and the history and the effects and everything. I think it's phenomenal and it's great. So I'd recommend that. Also, I'd recommend trying to go to a Latin Mass if there's one nearby. The other thing that their site has, I think it's latinmass.com is their handle now. And their website, thank you, Soul Assassin, latinmass.com, it has a mass finder. So you can find a local mass. You can also specify, hey, do you want to go to a diocesan mass? Do you want to go to an FSS, an FSSP mass? It also gives you the option for the SSPX chapels that are available too. If you don't know what that is, just know they are canonically irregular, but they still fulfill your obligations on Sunday, so there's nothing wrong with going to them. But basically, anywhere you are, there's going to be a Latin mass somewhere nearby, and so if you have a chance to go to one, I recommend it. And just go in with an open mind, an open heart. Don't bring a missal right away. Don't try to do too much. Just kind of sit there and take it in. And I think that if you go even just a few times, you'll eventually never want to leave and never want to go back because you'll find God again being worshipped in such a profound and just impressive but also appropriate way. And usually at a Latin Mass church, you're not as likely to find some of those things that maybe drive you away. I saw someone mentioning, or I think it was Snortopupus. Yeah, when I first encountered the sign of peace, I was a bit surprised when the person in front of me turned around and wanted to shake hands. It's like that was something that has always had, even when I was a kid,
Hmm.
something that always bothered me. Because I'm like, why? I don't want to talk to these people. I'm an introvert, especially. So it's like, what's going on here? But it also gives you that false sense of quote active participation. We should be actively participating in the liturgy, but we do that by prayer. We don't do that by saying some words at some specific time. Um, so I'd recommend, yeah, just trying it out, give it a shot. What do you got to lose? And
Yeah.
yeah, you can find me at OMB Reviews on all the different platforms. And it was great having these conversations.
Yay. I'm so glad you were here. Well,
Yes.
one thing that I got to mention is
Yeah.
about ad orientem, that if you go to the
Mm.
Latin Mass for the first time, they say that the priest puts his back to you. That's not what's going on. We're actually facing the same direction as the priest. He's like our captain, and we
Mm-hmm.
are all together facing him. He's not turning his back on us. He is with us. So if you go and see that and see, quote unquote, the priest rather putting his back to you, that's not what's going on.
Yes, and ad orientem worship is such an important thing because again, part of that video I was watching mentions how even the earliest churches of the first 2-3 centuries all were always oriented to the east, ad orientem, so that you'd be facing east. And that tells us, okay, how was the Mass celebrated? How was liturgy celebrated from the very beginnings? It was always to the east. It was always ad orientem. And it's something that I think if we were going to see any improvements in liturgy, even with the Novus Ordo, and I think there's a lot of issues with it, but to start, if you just even change that small thing, I think that would make a huge difference in how we view the Mass.
Precisely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Odin. And of course, you'll see Odin on Friday Night Tights on Fridays and other things as well. I'm going to be doing some more of my morning musings if they work out. I'm going to be going to Alaska next week, though, so I will have some sporadic things, but I hope to bring you all a lot of Teresa travels and seeing some glaciers, and fingers crossed, even though I know it's out of season to see the Northern Lights, but you never know. And hopefully by then we'll have a new pope.
Yes. I again, if I had to make predictions, last thoughts on Conclave, I think again, if it's going to be a Cardinal Paraline or even a Cardinal Sarah, a Sarah, or one of the ones that's being mentioned as Papabile, someone that's known, we will have a pope by Thursday, Friday of next week. If it's one of those two. If it's not by Friday that we have an answer, jury's going to be out on that one, because I think it could be a kind of an out of the ballpark compromise candidate, and who knows who that could be.
Yep. Either way, it's going to be very interesting, and it's not too often that we see things shaking up in the world, as you said, even despite who it's going to be, whether it's Francis 2.0 or whether it's someone more like Cardinal Sarah, we are going to have a change. And even if you're not Catholic, one could argue that, the Catholic Church in many ways, especially the Latin Rite Church, is the guardian of Western civilization in so many different ways. So who is the Pope will make a difference.
Amen.
So there, amen. Well, thank you everyone that's been here. Of course, we had Soul Assassin, we had Snorted Poops Cooper, we had Steve Kenobi, and he said, Tommy and the Guinea Pig Collective, Buddy Hepburn. If there's anyone else, DJ Play Nice, and thank you very much to all of my wrenches, and let's see, who else? If I missed anyone, it is not intentional that it just happens that the chat can jump around, and it can do that. And was it Steve said that he is not a Catholic, but he is very interested in it, and he bugs me and Lady Gravemaster all the time with questions. So yes, he said that earlier. I can't find it. There it is. I'm not Catholic at all. I like learning about it. I pester Teresa and Lady Gravemaster all the time. So yay. So keep questioning, Steve.
And we'll keep on praying for
you,
Steve.
We love everybody. So thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Have a great day. And be certain to go to the Latin Mass and pray for the church as we all pray for you.